Hello and welcome to the Black History Month panel of the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery at NASCAD University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. My name is Charmaine Nelson, and I'm a professor of art history and a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair and the director of the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery. How we're going to proceed today in the 90 minutes that we're together is first I'm going to do or offer a land acknowledgement. Then I'm going to introduce our three brilliant panelists who are amongst the first cohort of 5 virtual fellows that we have welcomed at the Institute. And then each of the panelists will speak for approximately 15 minutes and saving time at the end, hopefully about 20 minutes for questions from the audience, discussion and conversation between them as well. So I'll proceed. Thank you all for being here. So land acknowledgements, as many of you know, can become rather meaningless when they become performative. So this is something I have tried to avoid in my life since they have been introduced in the Canadian context. It's deeply problematic that they often become more about looking like you're doing something than any real commitment to redress and repair. That said, NASCAD is in Mi'kmaq, on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik or Maliseet people first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqiyik title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. Furthermore, these treaties were signed within the context of a genocidal European imperialism and colonialism, which sought to oppress, to control, and to contain Indigenous peoples across the Americas, and which resulted in the expropriation of 12 million Black Africans who were enslaved across the same territories and in Europe. Indigenous and Black peoples in various places like New France, which later became Quebec, were enslaved together, and in their shared bondage and resistance became kin. These shared histories have motivated me to make one of our 4 mandate areas at the Institute the overlooked study of Black and Indigenous relations within the context of Canadian and transatlantic slavery. Now it's my privilege to welcome our 3 very esteemed panelists, the three fellows who were in our first part of our cohort in the fall of 2021. First, I'll begin with Bruno. Bruno Véras is a historian and cultural producer native of Recife, Brazil. His research interests include the African diasporas, West African history, the transnational history of slavery, and the memory of slavery and reparations. His work also focuses and engages with public history, digital humanities, art education, and creative scholarship. He was a UNESCO consultant for the African Brazilian Studies and Museum exhibition at Fundag, so F-U-N-D-A-G is the acronym, in Brazil in 2014, and directed the awarded anti-racism art educational project in the Global South in 2015. He has been awarded research funds from the Brazilian Ministry of Culture and Education, UNESCO, the Government of Ontario, York University, MyTax, and the Centre International de Recherche sur l'Esclavage in 2021. Bruno is currently a PhD candidate in history at York University and the director of the art-based public history UNESCO project entitled Fragments of Memory, Artistic Representations of Diaspora Lives. And that's a part of the Slave Roots project with UNESCO. Bruno, if you can give us a wave so people can see who you are, that'd be great. After Bruno's presentation, it will be Sam Guan, Tonya Sam Guan Paris, to be more precise, and she was our artist in residence fellow. Bruno was one of our grad student fellows. So Tonya Paris, also known as Sam Guan, is an established Mi'kmaq and Nova Scotia artist activist based in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which rests upon the unceded Mi'kmaq, traditional Mi'kmaq territory, as I just mentioned in the land acknowledgement. Over the past 5 years, Sam Guan has had several art exhibitions and installations within the Nova Scotia community. Most notably, her contributions to the Dalhousie University Architectural Building, the Nova Scotia QE2 Mental Health Unit, and in 2017, when she received the Bronze Medal for Visual Artist of the Year from the Halifax Coast. Passionate about equality and empowering others through education and art, Sam Guan will be guest speaker this fall, or I guess this past fall you were, for both the Halifax Central Library and the Nova Scotia Career Development Association on the topics of anti-racism and anti-oppression. She is a regular contributor to the Mi'kmaq Native Friendship Center and is known throughout the community for her commitment to seeing positive change. So that is Tonya Samguan Perez. And our third presenter today is Jason Cyrus, another graduate student fellow. Jason Cyrus analyzes fashion and textile history to explore questions of identity, cultural exchange, and agency. He is a 2021 Isabel Bader Fellow in Textile Conservation and Research at the Agnes Etherington Center, Queen's University. This past October, he presented his research in History is Rarely Black or White, an exhibition exploring Victorian cotton, slavery, and its ongoing legacies. Cyrus has a master's degree in art history and curatorial studies from York University, and he started his PhD in the history of art at York University in October 2021. He has held research posts at the Art Gallery of Ontario and the Royal Ontario Museum. In January 2020, he curated York University's first fashion exhibition, Reframing Gender. Welcome to all three of you. I will cede the floor to Bruno. And again, each panelist will speak for approximately 15 minutes, and we will save questions and conversation for the end. Please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A or the chat. Thank you, and over to you, Bruno.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are in the world. I must say, I really feel very honored to be part of this panel. And I am very happy to contribute a bit with the discussions around slavery in Canada and the Canadian involvement with slaveries in a transnational context. And my presentation today is going to be about that. Let me share my screen and start my time here. Good. So this is my presentation for today. So I have many slides to show. So don't worry if I move with them quickly, because I'm not going to be really focusing on discussing many of these slides. What I'm going to try today is to discuss not really the content and the different biases of how different press, abolitionist press, commercial press, would discuss slave rebellions in the Americas, in the Canadian press. So I'm not going to analyze discourses. This is something I did in a previous presentation. But I'm going to try to explain and think about why the Canadian press was so worried about slave rebellions in Brazil. That's really actually the focus of my research. But also we have examples in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, in Haiti, in US, and different parts of the Americas. So I'm going to try to explain why the Canadian press, the Canadians, were so worried about slave rebellions happening in these places. And to think about, so this is something that I'm going to argue by the end of my presentation, the further involvement of Canadian merchants after the 1833 abolition of slavery in Canada with slave colonies and slave countries buying and profiting trading commodities produced by slave labor in Brazil, for example. So yes, as you all know, or maybe as you might know, the transatlantic slave trade was one of the biggest immigrant phenomena in human history, forced migration, and moved more than 12 million people across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas, from Chile to Canada. And these people, men, women, and children were shipped to the Americas due to different circumstances in Africa. And one is a specific one, and actually a very important one in early 19th century, was key for the enslavement and shipment of thousands and thousands of people to Brazil. That was the formation of the Sokoto Caliphate in the hinterlands of Africa, in the Sahel, where is today northern Nigeria, Niger, northern Cameroon, Chad. So the formation of these Muslim caliphates and states, and the formation of these new policies, these new states, was really responsible for the enslavement and the war and the shipment of many people to the coast. And the Europeans, Brazilians, and North Americans, they bought these people, men, women, and children, and shipped them as slaves to the Americas, as we said. So because of that, many Muslim Africans were sent to Brazil, or to US, or to Panama, or to Jamaica. We have documented many Muslim Africans in the 19th century living all across the Americas, including Canada. And in the first 30 years of the 19th century, these men and women, they were responsible for several rebellions in Bahia, where is today northeast Brazil. So Salvador is the capital of Bahia, received many Muslim Africans, enslaved Muslim Africans throughout the 19th century, and they really organized several rebellions. The 1835 one was the most important. So this rebellion happened in the night of the 24th to 25th of January. That was the last day of Ramadan, and more than 600 Africans went across the street trying to free some of their leaders who was in the prison, and fighting and trying to get their freedom. And this rebellion was huge. And the coverage of this rebellion was all around Brazil, but also all around the world. So using digital humanities and data mining, different techniques, and with the support of many research assistants working in this project. Some of them are also here attending to this panel, and I'm very grateful to them. Students from Brazil, from Cuba, from Congo, from Canada, from Nigeria, and different places helping with this. So we were able to find the coverage of this 1835 rebellion in several newspapers, from, I don't know, Hungary to Canada, to Argentina, to Scotland, to all around, things like in 12 different languages, talking about the rebellion and the fear of a continental Haiti happening in Brazil. So the ethos of Haiti was there, and the fear of slave rebellion was there. And this was not different in the Canadian press. So we got to analyze and look at several digital archives here in Canada, the Nova Scotian Provincial Archives, the Beaton Institute in Nova Scotia, excellent digital archives. The Archives Council of Prince Edward Island, the Bibliothèque Archives Nationales du Québec, Archives of Ontario, and Google News. We went throughout all these archives looking for articles in the Canadian press about slave rebellions. First, we started with the 1835 one, the Malay uprising, the Muslim African uprising. And then we got to find other ones, really interesting news that I'm not going really to read and analyze the discourses, but I'm going to think about, as I said, the why they were talking about these rebellions. Here we have some examples of the coverage in the 1835 rebellion, and the title of the presentation I got from this newspaper, La Minerve, from Montreal, talking about the plans, the numbers, the objectives of the rebels, the Muslim Africans in Bahia. Translation. Since this presentation is going to be recorded, you can pause the video and look at the slides. So yes, another one here, longer, also from the La Minerve. And this is not republished from news in French, in France or in England. This is really original Canadian material, something that's also very interesting. Another one from Le Canadien, Extractivé da América do Sul. a longer one talking about Brazil, lots of things about Brazil and the rebellion itself. And the question I'm going to try to answer quickly today is why the Canadian press was so worried about slave rebellion since the British Empire abolished slavery in 1833. There were no more slavery in Canada. And we can see throughout different articles in the newspapers, but also ship records, ship logs, port records, that although the British Empire abolished slavery in Canada too, the trade with slave colonies in the Caribbean and in South America continued. And actually, some of these news, they show that some merchants, some Canadian merchants, they would prefer to trade in slave colonies and countries where slavery still existed, instead of the British Islands in the Caribbean, where slavery was abolished. So this one talks about sugar. This other one talks about the trade of timber being shipped to Brazil after the abolition of slavery in the British colonies, as I said. And we can see in these newspapers, in the same newspapers that we collected as a group, in a group effort with the research assistants from all these places, information about sugar, especially sugar, coffee, and mocha from Brazil being imported to Canada. Not just from Brazil, but also Cuba, that was a Spanish colony. All these commodities produced with slave labor and being taxed when arriving in Canada, and being sold in Canada and the Maritimes and the other parts of West today Canada. This is a port report from Gaspé, but it's also possible to find the other ones for Halifax, for Newfoundland, and other spaces. We can see here, for example, yes, so these are ships arriving from Brazil, leaving, actually ships from Brazil arriving in Gaspé. We have one here. We also have like 6 ships going back to Brazil, and we can see here the number of people, the number of men working the ships, for sure. Lots of enslaved Brazilians, because they were part of the crew of Brazilian ships arriving in Gaspé to trade, especially what I said, coffee, mocha, and sugar. But we can also find other records, for example, for Montreal, for 1831, Canadian ships from Montreal going to Brazil to sell most likely timber, and bringing back south or the other things back to Canada for 1831. This one is for 1871. Here we can see the trade of cod. So dry cod, we can see here the quantity, the value, being shipped to England, South America, Brazil. And it's interesting because they divide Bahia, the province of Brazil, from Brazil. So this shows the amount of trade to Brazil. Naples, Portugal, the British Caribbean, and United States. What's also interesting here, because when we talk about the Canadian involvement with slavery and the trade between, let's say, the Caribbean to Canada, molasses, liquor, and the slaves, we usually look at the trade between just between Canada and the Caribbean. But these numbers really show that this trade was way, how can I say? They would trade way farther to Brazil, to Bahia, and divide actually these places. And this shows that more research on economic history would be needed to understand more these connections between not just Canada and Jamaica, Canada and the Caribbean, but also Canada and Brazil. Because these are, I'm sure we can find like slaves being shipped from Brazil to Canada too, just like the case with the Caribbean. I am sure, especially after 1822, it was a mark for Brazil. So So yes, these numbers shows these connections. This is a picture of the database we are creating, and you can see that we have news from, I don't know, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, Fabio, Nina, João, Gustavo, Rene. Many people worked in this database. We have thousands of records talking about slave rebellion. And the reason why Canada, the Canadian press, was so worried about slave rebellions happening in Cuba, in Brazil, and other parts is exactly because of these capitalistic connections of trade in commodities produced by slave labor that was cheaper. And many Canadian merchants would prefer to go to Cuba and Brazil to trade bacalhau de Nova Terra, the cod from Newfoundland that was very famous in Brazil. They really they really trade and build trade connections with places where slavery was already abolished. So the point is, after 1833, slavery was abolished in Canada, but they would still profit trading, buying, and selling Canadian products and buying slave-produced commodities into Canada. So the connections between slavery and Canada goes beyond slaves in Canada, but also we can discuss the contradictions and the ideological implications of the continuity of the support of Canada to slave colonies and slave countries in buying and trading these commodities: sugar, coffee, mocha, South, selling timber, selling cod in Brazil. That's the case. So here we can see all the examples that we are going to make available in the Institute's social media and other spaces for Cuba, for Jamaica, yes, this is about Cuba, for Haiti. And that's it. Just something for us to think about, something that I already presented. That's the content itself and the biases of the Canadian press discussing slave rebellions. But today I tried to think about why the Canadian press was so worried about a 1835 rebellion happening in Brazil, another one happening in Cuba, another one happening in Jamaica, and the trade connections and the profit from the Canadian provinces to this trade would explain this concern about the disruption that slave rebellions happening in these places would cause to the trade. And there is still lots to analyze around this trade between Canada and Brazil. Professor Glassman, he wrote a really interesting article talking about these connections, a trade commission going from Canada to the Caribbean and then going to Brazil in middle 19th century to analyze the chances of trade. And this happened throughout 1831 with a ship coming from Montreal that I was able to find, going to Brazil to trade, or cod being shipped to Brazil, Bahia, throughout 1871 until the end of slavery. And this would explain, I argue, the interest of the Canadian press on slave rebellions happening in Brazil, the Caribbean, and other parts of the Americas. That's it. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful, Bruno. Thank you so much. And I hope everybody can see too, part of what Bruno is demonstrating is the power and the impact that the digital humanities have had on the study of transatlantic slavery. And really transatlantic slavery is arguably at the forefront of the digital humanities. And you can see why in this demonstration of the global, I think it's beyond, we can say, transatlantic coverage of these slave rebellions in Brazil. Thank you so much, Bruno. So we're going to hand it over now to Sam Guan. When you're ready, Sam.
Good morning. Thank you everyone for being here. I am the resident artist, so mine is, my presentation is based on art. I kind of took Bruno's knowledge of the trading and slave trade and Jason's knowledge of the fashion and kind of put them together to make my piece, I guess, in a way. Okay, this is just me in the beginning. Usually what you see is the red hand for MMIW. But what we don't realize is that a lot of Indigenous Black people in Canada are also mixed with Indigenous blood. So I chose to do the opposite way to make the Black Indigenous voice heard as well. And just thank you to everyone that was involved from beginning to end. We appreciate everything. Thank you so much. And switch page, I guess. Sorry. I'm not doing this on my end, so I do apologize. I will say thank you very much to the team behind the scenes, because without them, I wouldn't have a slideshow. I'm not tech savvy. I'm a visual artist. Freedom is No Game is the name of my piece, or pieces, because it is a larger piece of several pieces, smaller pieces. So we can go to the first picture. So this is the actual show that we held at the Halifax Public Library on Spring Garden Road. They were gracious enough to donate the space, the time, the lighting, everything for this piece to be public. They wanted to be in conjunction with this project. They think it was a beautiful idea as well as we do. So thank you so much to them as well. I decided to do a chessboard, and what it allowed me to do was represent everything in our history visually. So as we see, we'll see each side of the chessboard. So the first picture shows the Indigenous side of the chessboard. So we have the king and queen, and the knights, bishops, rooks, and the pawns. And on the second picture, we have the African side of the chessboard. I will say this to make my understanding a little bit, because it is quite layered. The parts of it are turned with their backs towards each other, because if it is not facing each other as a chessboard, then there is no game. So there's no combative, there's no competition, there's no, I guess, competing against each other. So for me to turn the pieces backwards was to stand in solidarity with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, as well as our Black brothers and sisters. If we can change screen, please. This is my version of the Canadian flag. I'm a little bit controversial because I do like to speak my mind. I find that when you are an activist, you can get a very different response with pretty pictures than you can sometimes with, I guess, let me see how I don't want to say force, because it's not necessarily force, but it's the delivery sometimes as well. And so when you have pretty things like this ribbon skirt mixed with kente cloth, and you wear it to a powwow, you'll have other people walk up to you and ask you about your heritage versus separating you because of the exact same thing. And next slide, please. Freedom is No Game, of course, has to represent the residential school and the over 7,000 children that have been found. I chose the symbols of freedom in both our communities. So our Pan-African colors and our fist, as well as the I Don't Know More movement of feathers and medicine wheel. Next slide, please. So I wanted to show the board itself and how we set it up. This came to pass just in talking and networking, and what I wanted to visually see. And it actually worked for my point of what I was trying to show. Next screen, please. Okay, so this is a closer version of the pieces set up. I do have them separated so that I am able to talk about each piece individually. So this is just a closer look at it. Next screen, please. Okay, so this is the king and queen on the African side. These are handmade dolls by me. They have a wire skeleton, so they are posable. I went as detailed as I could, right down to fingers and toes. Traditional kente cloth, traditional beads from Africa. And I did take time to talk about different styles. The female also wears I'm sure Bruno will appreciate this, a piece of lapalazula around her neck on a copper necklace, as well as a copper bracelet with cowrie shells in her ears. The male also carries a drum, which just is another African representation. Next slide, please. These are the baskets that also represent the bishops, I believe, which is representative of prosperity and food and subsistence, which is what the church or the bishop represents on the chessboard. Next slide, please. These also represent the Pan-African feel of the fighting and the voice. So these represent I would say the rooks, which are just behind the pawns, because of course we as people are in positions of being pawns, of being moved by our government, of church, of just different mentalities. So this is once we started to get our voices back, because as we see, Black and Indigenous people across the world are actually starting to be heard and not being afraid to speak up. So these are the African pawn pieces. They're a representation of different countries from Africa that were in the transatlantic slave trade. And those of us that are usually descendants of most of these countries, if not one, several. These are just more representations of the different countries involved in the transatlantic slave trade as well. For the Indigenous king and queen pieces, we have a chief as well as a chiefess. I chose to go with the medicine wheel colors for the chief to represent all shades of people. It is also a representation of my family, where my uncle was, not anymore, chief of Cree Nation, as well as Swift, which is the female, is representation of my grandmother's line as well. So this would be the king and queen on the Indigenous side. She represents the residential school children, as well as the orange and the smudge bowl. And the eagle feather and medicine bag. Again, they have the metal skeletons, so they are posable. They have human hair. And I chose to go with no faces so people could actually see themselves in the dolls. Next slide, please. These are the baskets or the bishops on the Indigenous side. And as you see, they're filled with medicines. So they represent what's important: prosperity, health, together, community on both sides. For the Indigenous side, I chose to represent the medicines. And on the African side, I chose to represent prosperity. And next slide, please. These are the drums. This represents the night pieces. This one is actually hand painted by myself. It went to my grandson, and the smaller drum that you see there went to my nephew. They're made from actually elk hide, and a friend of mine made the red drum. It comes in from the Abenaki tribe. His name is Diamageech, which means little moose, hence the moose. And I chose to use these drums because it represented my family, and it represents the village that we choose to raise our children in. And next slide, please. Again, the I Don't Know More movement colors, as well as the feather. It's in essence the same as the Pan-African colors and our fists that we use on our flags and shirts. It just represents together strength and the fact that we're here and our existence is the resistance. Next slide, please. And these are the pawn pieces on the Indigenous side. They represent the different tribes: the Cree tribe, the Inuit, Métis, and of course, Mi'kmaq tribe. These are the tribes that have been affected by the residential schools. Next slide, please. And these are 4 other tribes that I chose, which are Mohawk, Iroquois, and Blackfoot, Ojibwe, and Sioux. They have also been affected by the residential school. And why make dolls? I wanted to make sure that the children could enjoy the piece as well, and that things were pretty and soft, because some of our realities, well, most of our realities and histories are so hard and harsh. So I wanted to soften it just a little bit, so that it can be taken in a different context. We want people to learn so it doesn't repeat. We don't always want to be seen as taken in anger, and you can't be mad at a doll. So I chose to use that for that. And again, I chose to make them faces, so that everyone can see themselves in the dolls. I wanted it to represent not one particular person, but everybody. And next slide, please. And how can we lead to meaningful change? To acknowledge it, to learn, to understand, and to take time. I'm a community worker, and I believe that it starts with our babies. Yes, the adults need to learn as well. But when we teach our children beautiful things, then they become beautiful people. And even through all this pain, the Indigenous and Black people have found beauty in all of the things that we've gone through. And I like to represent that. So these are just a close-up of the moccasins that the actual king and queen on the Indigenous side have on. And again, like I said, as an artist, I am very layered in who I am and what I like to say and what I like to represent. So I like to break things down just a little bit. And next slide, please. Just one last close-up of everything all together, to show the representation in a whole. And the next slide, please. And so we're at the end, and so I appreciate everything. I'm pretty quick. I don't have to, mine's more visual, so I don't have to go into as much detail, I think. But thank you very much, and on to the next panelist.
Thank you so much, Sam Guan. And I just want to point out for everyone as well that Sam Guan was incredible in that she conceptualized and completed the entire artwork within the period of the fellowship, which was not an obligation, of course, because the fellowship's for 4 months. So extraordinary, Sam Guan. Thank you so much. And we'll welcome questions for you at the end. So over to you now, Jason.
Thank you, Charmaine. And it is, as you can gather from listening to my esteemed and brilliant fellows, it's a huge honor to be able to work alongside and research alongside them. And Charmaine, thank you so much for the opportunity, not just with the choice of the fellowship, but also bringing us together to do this work. I am if Bruno is the resident researcher and Sam Guan is the artist, I am the curator of the cohort. And my work primarily looks at connections between cultural exchange across history, and using clothing and fashion as a lens of telling intersectional stories. And what I've done is, in a sense, or my ongoing project is asking the question of, in what way can we learn from studies of Canadian slavery? How does this impact the way that we live and work and are on in the ways that we are now? So what I will do is I will share screen and I will give you a taste of the curatorial project that Charmaine and I are working on. So the project is called Dressing for the Resistance, Style as Armor Among Black Canadians. And it primarily looks at the ways in which the way that we dress and the way we put ourselves together, specifically as Black Canadians, is so layered in both a personal and historic way. Personal in the sense of the overarching intersectional isms that we face, whether that be structural in terms of racism, homophobia, sexism, and the ways that our own personal history, where we come from, how we have ended up in Canada, whether like Sam Guan, their own history has always been here and tied in to the very fabric of this land, or whether someone like me, who is a new, relatively new immigrant in the last 20 years to Canadian soil. So what Dressings for This does is, in a sense, it looks at the research that's come out of the fellows in the first cohort in where slavery and its connections in Canada and elsewhere are connected to how we look at Blackness and how Blackness shows up in Canada. Just a few slides to show the work I've done thus far. This is my first exhibition at York University called Reframing Gender, looking at connections between queer BIPOC individuals of color and dress. My current exhibition at the Agnes Ethnic Art Center that Charmaine graciously mentioned, History is Really Black or White, connecting the cotton industry in the Victorian era of the 1800s to the transatlantic slave trade. Looking at it specifically at the humanity of who was involved, specifically in exploitative labor practices vis-a-vis slavery, and its connections to Canada and the way that we understand Canadian identity. So what I will do here, in a sense, is show the key pillars or stories that I'm looking at to give an idea of how the exhibition and how we are framing this wide historical lens of looking at connections between slavery, identity, Blackness, and dress. So as Bruno so brilliantly mentioned already, there are so many wide connections between these global arcs of slavery and Canada and the ways that they show up in Canada and their connections elsewhere. What we're looking at here is Francois Malpart de Beauport's portrait of a Haitian Canadian woman from 1786 from the McCord collection, as well as these are fugitive slave ads of two runaway enslaved folks, Cash and Nemo. And what I'm looking at here in the ways is the way that dress is an important part of framing the way that we see these identities. Specifically in Portrait of a Haitian Canadian Woman, I'm thinking of how the ways that her own portrait would have been composed and its connections to her own history before she ends up in Quebec, and regional dress in Haiti and how that's so much formed by the Haitian Revolution and, of course, regional dress in Haiti, and what it would have meant for her to be in that portrait, how she was composed, what her own agency was, and what role clothing played. Another important person thinking through two of the global connections of slavery within Canada is Nicolas Saïd. This is a carte de visite from 1863, between 1863 and 1866. And what's interesting about Nicolas Saïd is that he is from Eastern Sudan, but ends up in Gatineau, Quebec. And we've got his autobiography that details his own trajectory, but also the role that clothing played in his own formation of self, as well as Muhammad Bakwakwa, who was originally from Benin, enslaved in Brazil, and then ends up in Chatham, Ontario, of all places. And we also have his autobiography that was published by an abolitionist, Samuel Moore. And this is from 1853 and again, 1854, but looking at, again, the role that clothing has played in their formation of self. And why I started so far back is to show that when I jump into the more modern era, it's important to see the connections between how we are now and the ways that clothing and the identities of formerly enslaved folks have really been closely connected, and how their own makeup and coming from different places, would have been from Benin via Brazil to Chatham, or from Haiti to Quebec, or from, in the case of Saïd, from Sudan into Gatineau, how clothing plays a role in this formation of self. Fast forwarding now into the late 1800s, thinking now too of not just the Caribbean and what's happening on the African continent, and of course South America with Brazil, but what's happening too down south. The influence of migration through the Underground Railroad from the United States into Canada, and the ways that folks settling in Lower Canada, Southern Ontario as we now know it, Upper Canada, Southern Ontario as we now know it, use clothing as a way of reframing and reclaiming their identities. These are tintypes from the Buxton National Historic Site, wonderfully taken care of by curator Shannon Prince. And here we see the influence and the presence of clothing in the ways that these folks are really using photography and style as a medium of counteracting the enslaved narrative. Now, what I'm trying to do is not just show connections in terms of photographic and art history, but looking at examples of clothing and using and finding examples of clothing within archives, specifically ones linked to the enslaved, is an extremely hard task. That is an ongoing part of my research with the fellowship. This is a dress made by Cumbo, who was an enslaved person in the North Carolina Museum. And this was made for what we presume would have been Cumbo's owner. And these similar dressmaking skills we can see in Elizabeth Keckley on the right, Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker, the wife of Abraham Lincoln, and how she used her own dressmaking skills to buy her own freedom from enslavement. And this historical way of thinking, of dressing, of using clothing as this way of buying one's freedom, of reframing self, in the case of Akwakwa and Said, and even to some extent, portrait of a Haitian Canadian woman, how their clothing reflects where they're coming from. It reflects who the places they would have been, the experiences they would have had, and how it forms their identity as Black Canadians. Connecting that now to the late 60s, the large influx of Caribbean migration. And here, this is from the Roms Family Camera Network, that looking at a family snapshot of the family of Kenneth Montague, a prominent Black Canadian dentist, as well as art collector and a curator himself. And what I would like to do is, while it's the clothing and the research of the historical folks that will speak, I'd like to speak with, or at least continue conversations rather with Kenneth and his family, in the ways that dressing when they arrived in Canada and in this new assimilation to a new land, what role did clothing play? And to look at, for example, what similarities could we see between that and, for example, that of the folks in the tintypes that are coming through the Underground Railroad, or reading the biography of Akwakwa and Said. Connecting that quickly to the 80s, Iris Simpson is an integral part of Canadian fashion history. She was a buyer for Eaton's, as well as she opened the first Saint Laurent boutique at Holt Renfrew. And she was for such a long time, the sole Black female presence in the Canadian contingent that represented luxury. Agnes has quite a fantastic archive. She's a Jamaican immigrant herself, but she also talks about the way that she used clothing to combat the misogyny, the racism, the intersecting systemic things that she had to deal with as a visibly Black female person in a predominantly white world, in the ways that clothing helped and hindered a lot of her own progress. And connecting it now to a present, this is Sulu Kalema and Sinada Reddy, two queer and non-binary and trans individuals who interviewed as part of York University's Reframing Gender project in the way that they used clothing to really understand, to develop, and to speak to their own identities as QT BIPOC folk. And why I think I'm using Sin and Sulu's stories as the last of the pillars in conjunction to reaching all the way back to Portrait of a Haitian Canadian Woman, in a sense, is to sit with story and to understand how the way that we dress over time has really become entrenched in our minds. This notion of respectability politics, this notion of pushing against and using clothing to challenge, or using clothing to assimilate, and the ways that how we're coming from different places, how we have come from different places, and how that is so much influenced by the presence of slavery in Canada and its global connections. Like I said, whether it be from places like Benin, or from Eastern Sudan, or from Brazil, or from Haiti, and connecting it to how we live now. That was a very, very rushed overview, but what I'm hoping to do is, as the months progress, is to continue working with the Institute and with Charmaine to look at what archives can we mine, what stories can we continue to record and tell, and to come up with, from this list, 6 pillars that we can ground this wide historical overview in story, and folks can get a sense of, as Sam Guan so brilliantly showed in that chess piece, in the ways that our identities are complex and they're so based and connected to the presence of slavery in Canada and to the presence of systemic oppression. Thank you so much, and it's been an honor to share with you today.
Thank you, Jason, Bruno, and Sam. So we're gonna, if you can all come back on screen as well, I'm gonna start fielding some questions towards you from myself and you for each other, and of course from the audience. First off the top though, just a couple of quick ones. Amanda Traeger, who is a Master of Fine Art student in Education, asked Bruno if you can recommend or throw out a couple titles for the histories of slave rebellion in Brazil. Is there anything to recommend off the top to the people who are attending?
I can recommend the 2 authors that you can Google up. The first one is Paul Lovejoy. He's a professor at York University. He's a specialist on transatlantic slave trade and African diasporas, African history. The other one is João Reis, R-E-I-S. You're going to find lots of articles written by him in English, in French, in Portuguese, and he is a full professor at Federal University of Bahia. For me, is the biggest historian in Brazil. And they wrote a lot about slave rebellions. And Reis, he's a specialist in the Malay uprising. That's the Muslim African uprising. For Canada, you can look at the biographies that Jason showed in his presentation. Really, really interesting presentation. All the connections. Bakwa, Nicolas Said, because they lived in Canada and they were Muslim Africans. And Richard Pierpoint, that was a war hero of the 1812 war in Canada. And he was from Fouta Djallon. So he came from the hinterlands of Senegal. And he was a Muslim, Black Muslim living in Canada in early 19th century.
Thank you so much, Bruno. And a quick one for Sam. Professor Rebecca Hannon has asked where people can see your artwork in person. Sam, anything coming up where you're going to be exhibiting the piece?
It will be shown again this summer.
Do you know anything more specific to location?
Yeah, it will be at the Public Library on Spring Garden Road.
Okay.
Right now, myself and Dreadlocks and Kindness are working in conjunction with the library in this project. Mm-hmm. So it will be shown throughout the summer. I believe, mid-July. So the second week in July.
Okay. And then as people populate their new questions, I have one for each of you. So first to Bruno. So Wow. I think it was really powerful when you said, listen, we need to think about the ideological implications of Canadians and Canadian news media, Canadians and Canadian economy continuing to support slave societies post-abolition. And of course, just to point out to everybody, abolition, again, as Bruno pointed out, for Canada is 1834 because we remained a part of the British Empire during the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, right? So here we are after that date, no slavery or chattel slavery being practiced at home, but still continuing to facilitate the exploitation of enslaved African and Indigenous people elsewhere. And if I can just point out to everyone too, we're not alone in this, of course. In the American North, a lot of shipbuilders continued to trade with and sell their ships to territories, their slave ships to territories that were still slaving. So, our hands are extremely dirty in this regard, but other areas too, and other regions continued the same type of transatlantic trade with slave societies. So, Bruno, can you comment more on what, dive into those ideological implications for us as a nation that has never reckoned with the 200-year history of Canadian slavery under the French and the British, right? Never mind this post-slavery history that you're articulating so well.
Yes, it's a hard question. Got me nervous to unmute myself. I don't know, thinking comparatively on this ideological implication to memory, maybe thinking about the connections of, let's say, from the slave times, on how we remember about them today, like memory, the phenomenon of memory comparing to other places. Canada is an interesting place because, for example, in Brazil, we can't deny our role on enslavement and the slavery and the state profiting of slavery. In US, impossible too. There are so many movies, so many historical evidences. But Canada, you hide this so well, Yes. And I don't know how, as you explained, 200 years of slavery and the involvement, the later involvement with profiting, the state profiting with the trade with slave societies, just like England, Europe, trading in Africa, in Brazil, etc. So for me, it's really fascinating on how memory was built, hiding all these years, hiding all this population, hiding all this exploitation, when this is impossible in other countries, So I think in addition to really understanding slavery in Canada, is also important our work of research on memory and how this was shifted to the North Star, to the land of freedom,
to the Underground Railroad, right? And that's what we do every Black History Month too, right? So part of it is, what do we rehearse? What do we venerate? How do we want to remember ourselves? And of course, we can understand why people would rather remember their ancestors as abolitionists than as pro-slavery advocates, right? So, but that erasure that you're talking about too, Bruno, where as you've gone and mined the data, it's there. Right? You've gone and seen the newspapers. The evidence is incontrovertible. So it's what will it take then to expose that? And what is the act too of memory? The other side of that, what is the act of forgetting? How much work have we in Canada done with creating this historical national amnesia? That takes work, right?
It is something to be studied, how this was built, this forgetting through literature, through art production, through different, cultural artifacts throughout the 19th century and 20th century. Absolutely. So understanding also the memory of erasing the history of slavery is something to research.
Right, absolutely. And Chris Gismondi, who was another, of course, fellow from this cohort who began in January, throughout to you, Bruno, that, of course, the London stock market was also heavily invested in U.S. cotton after 1833 as well, right? So a lot of dirty hands in terms of who continues investing and profiting from slavery, even when slavery in their region is done. Stay with you, Bruno, one more question here. So fascinating what you've mapped here is a global white preoccupation with the potential of Black freedom and Black rebellion from slavery, right? What did the anxiety actually look like in those texts? How were these white authors and printers expressing the fear of Black freedom and another Haiti. And just so everybody understands, the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, resulted in the first time then that self-liberated, formerly enslaved Africans were able to take a whole colony, right, and create a new nation then that was free of slavery. So this terrified, of course, the transatlantic world and slave societies. So Bruno, can you articulate how was that anxiety expressed in print?
In two ways, depending on the ideological background of the newspaper or the place. Italian newspapers would publish something in a different way than a Canadian or a US newspaper. Hungarian one another way because they're not really involved on the slave trade. They didn't have slave colonies. But we can point to two different ways. Haiti is really an ethos, really important, of comparison, and this fear of a second Haiti with a continental size in a slave rebellion where people would write in Arabic things that they couldn't understand. So this fear was there of a Haiti, of a, how can I say, people who could write and read in Arabic. So we can read this there. And this fear would lead to two answers. So it's how I can check. I can think about two ways. The first one was really, we need to repress. We need to create new laws and regulations to control the slave population. And this happened in Brazil or in Cuba or in different places where we can talk about a second slavery. That's a concept that many stories are discussing now for Cuba, Brazil, and the US for middle 19th century. The second one was really towards abolition of the trade. People were really freaking out. I got a report, for example, I think from a French newspaper saying, no, a British newspaper, but I think was reposted in a Canadian newspaper, talking about something like, so if the French decide to invade the Caribbean, like our Caribbean islands, this is going to be concerning because they are going to support our slaves to rebel against ourselves. So we need to do something about that. So it's better to free the slaves, you know? So this white fear, this anxiety pushed in one side to repression and control, and the other side really towards, let's say, the politics for abolition. And it's something that I argue in my chapter 1, that this slave rebellion, this Muslim African slave rebellion had a global impact towards the discussion of abolition of slavery because of white fear.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Bruno. And a question for Sam. So Sam, it's brilliant, this conceptualization of the issues you're working through in terms of Blackness, Black indigeneity, and Black indigeneity. How did you come up with the idea of a game or a strategy as a mechanism through which to narrate these specific histories, as opposed to some other way? Was it always for you going to be about a chess game, or were there other options that you played with at the beginning?
For this particular project, it was always a chess game. Because as being Black and Indigenous, my grandmother's a residential school survivor. So we were always taught very young that the government used us as pawns, right, to maneuver things, to gain access to stuff, to be the token person so that they can get the brown skin money, right? Just to have one person. So, and being raised in Nova Scotia, I'm fully aware that our racism comes with a smile and a handshake. And a lot of times it comes with grants and good paying jobs. And, you know, it appears that everything's all great. So it's a game. And we people of color, especially Indigenous to Nova Scotia, we know how to play the game. And so it's not always what you know, where other people go to university, get knowledge, the degrees, and automatically can get a job on the knowledge and all the things they've done. With us, it's definitely who you know, because unless it's somebody like you, a lot of times you don't get the opportunity. Right? And you've met them in circles, or they've heard of you, or your community somehow, they know somebody's brothers, sisters, uncles married to, you know, and the communities are pretty close. So you kind of know each other. And And the government sets it like that. And they set us against each other to make us all, even oppression. They set layers of oppression. Well, you know, you're Native, but you're not Black. So why are you complaining? Or you're this, but you're not that. So why are you complaining? And they give us layers of oppression. And then the oppressed people kind of battle over who's more oppressed. And it doesn't, and they do that because it keeps us separate. We're battling each other. We forget that we have power, and we have power in togetherness. And, you know, we see this, especially being biracial and coming from two totally different, identical similarities versus their differences. And the things that we do to help each other survive, because we did it together. We're still here together. Like I said, one of the things that we utilize a lot is our existence is.
Okay, I think we're having some tech problems with you, Sam Gone, but we did hear most of that. So thank you for that. That really.
Apologize.
No, that's good. We got most of it for sure. Your face froze a little bit, but thank you for that wonderful answer. Jason, to you. Okay, listen, let's lay this down for people. I think most people don't understand the central importance of dress, of clothing in the lives of enslaved people. Can you break down some of that history for people in terms of what did clothing mean to strategically impoverished people who did not necessarily have control of what they wore?
Absolutely. I mean, it's so layered. One, you know, the clothing that they would have had would have been some type of marker of where they came from or who they were, which would have been the very first thing that had been stripped away from them. I mean, you can think of folks coming off the slave ships and every aspect of personal marking that they would have had, jewelry, some type of anything that reminded them of their own humanity would have been completely and totally stripped away so that they can be seen as chattel and they can be seen as own property. So what fascinates me about the court painting of the portrait of the Haitian Canadian woman is, I mean, yes, there's so many layers to unpack in the fact that, you know, she's obviously being posed as an object to be consumed, you know, with her breasts. And we can think of what agency she would have had in the sitting of the portrait and everything else. But what I would like to continue looking at is that though there's still some markings, there's still some material evidence, her identity in Canada, of her connection to Haiti.
To Haiti, right.
Exactly. And how even in subtle ways, that is, a reminder of the story that she has, that she has, and the ways that reflects the connections between, as Bruno so brilliantly said, like how the uprisings that were happening in the Caribbean, Brazil, and that's influence in Canada, in the ways, and it's all reflected in her dress. What, too, I think is so important looking at jumping to the tintypes is the way that not just was clothing used as this way of trying to kind of hold on to some sense of self, but this sense of remaking self, right? This, how the folks in the tintypes used clothing. You can think of their horrific history through American slavery, at least the slavery down south, but how they would have then used clothing in these sittings, in the studio, as this reclamation of self. But then clothing can also be this thing that can entrap. We can think of the fugitive slave ads, the ones of Cash and Nemo, specifically of how, someone's dressed, their lack of dress, whether they have shoes or they don't have shoes, or in the case of Duchess, and the clothing that she was wearing that was hers. How then even in those ads, clothing is then being used as this thing to troll, as a marker, as a way of pointing someone out so they can then be captured again. So clothing and Blackness and slavery is so layered, it's so complex.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's important to do this show, or at least to look at it curatorially, is to, I think, create some type of public-facing way that we can understand how incredibly complex and layers these things are, but how they show up in the way that we live our lives now. Like the history that we're talking about is hundreds of years, but it affects the way that we live our lives now. It's in our thinking, it's in our ideologies, it's in the ways, the conversations we have, it's in how we dress, whether that's conscious or unconscious.
Right. And you mentioned respectability politics. And just to go back to the portrait for a moment, and I know we've discussed this at length, but now just so everybody knows and everybody's on the same page with us, there's a huge conversation among scholars in transatlantic slavery studies of whether or not to even use a term like agency for enslaved people. So is it just a series of 4 choices and you're picking the one that's least lethal to you? And just to point out to people so they understood, Marie-Thérèse Amir, we've now reclaimed her name through the scholarship of someone like Marcel Trudel, excuse me. That's the name of that Black sitter in that portrait. She was owned by Bokor and his wife, which means what? She was not a patron of her own likeness. She did not control that portrait. She did not say, paint me this way, make me look like this. He controlled everything. So the exposed breast juxtaposed with a tray of tropical fruit, her hypersexualization, people, she's made to look like she's smiling. Okay. Do we understand, right?
And hyper-exotified. Yep.
Thank you. And how this ties in then to the endemic and institutionalized exploitation of Black women as breeders of new enslaved property, right? Because slavery has this matrilineal order. You're an enslaved female, you have a child, I own you, I own the child. So you have to understand, right?
And this is what you should look like. This is what you should look like. This is how, I believe it's in the case of Bakwakwa, Bruno, please correct me if I'm wrong, where there's a sense of where he, at one point, he adopts the kente cloth and the dress, because this idea of what's considered authentic African clothing, even though his own history was so layered, and from Benin to Brazil, and then to then being in Ontario, how yet still pushing up against what is considered, that construction, like you're saying, Charmaine, especially in that portrait, of how she's so controlled in what she's represented, and how that represents some type of what from a Eurocentric idea is authenticity, right? Of where she is from.
Absolutely, absolutely. So Emily Davidson would also like to ask, Bruno, jump in on that first.
Just a very small question, maybe something for us to think with Jason. Through the case of Joe, the fugitive slave that you so brilliantly wrote about him, and others also, like a native from Africa. They in the slave ships, they were undressed, they were naked, like their identity and all the elements. But some of them arrive in Canada, they would still have scarifications, the ethnic marks, as a way to identify and think about their own identity. And so how this element would add to the discussion around dressing, garments, and identity in the Canadian case, I think maybe Joe and others would be good points to think about these connections,
For sure. And so that everybody's on the same page with who Joe is. Joe, to my knowledge, is the most outwardly resistant enslaved person in Canadian history. We have 6 sets of fugitive slave ads across about 9 years for 5 different escapes from his co-owners, who were William Brown and Thomas Gilmore, who were the co-founders of the Quebec Gazette. And Joe had been forced north, we know from a letter in 1768 from New York or Philadelphia, when that pair wrote to their mentor and said, send us a Negro boy. And of course, the brutality of slavery and the total disregard for enslaved families is there too, because they didn't say, send us a Negro boy and his mother, or send us a Negro boy and his father. They said, we just want a boy between 15 and 20 to put to the press, fit to put to the press. So they intended to force him to work in the printing press. So yes, Joe, will we ever be able to decode, for instance, what Joe's ethnicity was? Because typically the Canadian slave owner the typical Canadian slave owner knew nothing about African ethnicity or nationhood, because dominantly the Black enslaved people coming into the space were from where? They're African Canadian, they're born here, they're African American, and they're Creoles or people born in the Caribbean, places like Haiti, Martinique, Guadeloupe, Jamaica, Barbados. So they didn't know what to do with Joe. They wouldn't have known how to describe his African languages. And if he had scarification, Bruno, to your point, hell, if we know, Brown never bothered to describe it, right? So yes, that the layering of dress, of bodily practice, and of course, dress as defined by someone like Buckridge includes bodily adornments and bodily marks, right? Absolutely.
Absolutely, yes.
So Jason, do you want to jump in on that too? Any thoughts come up when you're thinking about?
I mean, you both brilliantly. I'm just gonna add my 2 cents, which is yes, scarification, tattooing, any form of bodily mortification would have been an important marker of self.
Right.
Something that I think I've added to my list in terms of looking for ways of looking not just for folks and their own connections to identity and how that shows up in their physical appearance, but because like I said, while it's quite difficult to look for examples of garments within archives, maybe it's a case now of looking more broadly and looking at photography as well. Photography is being involved, but now looking at photography for these scarifications, looking at archives for, in a sense, getting creative as to what archives were mining, right? And how look for the ways that folks still held on to some shred of self in spite of this brutal brutality of enslavement.
Of slavery, absolutely. And so Jason and Bruno, I think we have an insight into your research process. I think, Sam, people are asking, can you shed some more light on what is that research process for you as an artist researcher and an artist scholar? What does that look like?
For me, it's the same sort of research, but I do visual. So I start to look at and I read as well. So I'm involved and I ask questions and I research, and I have 2 great fellows that I can go pick their brain and get all kinds of great information. And then I take that and make it a visual.
And then, turn it into the visual. Okay, so very similar maybe to what Jason and Bruno do, or myself, but it's the outcome for you that shifts everything. Okay, fantastic.
Exactly.
So I want to throw out to the 3 of you, give you an opportunity, because we don't have very many questions coming in, although people are putting really wonderful comments and supportive comments. Any questions for each other, you wonderful first cohort? Or have you already asked them already? Because I know you spend time together as it is, right?
This isn't so much more a question as it is, I think, a comment, as in the way that I think we so often silo research and artistic practice and curation, and how much I think the 3 of us have really informed each other. At least I could say selfishly, I've been quite informed by both of your work. Just looking at, with Sam Guan, how that chessboard shows in a sense, the implementation or the very nature of everything we're chatting about. How, how folks from different places being in Canada, interacting with Indigenous nations, and how that all kind of creates this tension in the board, right? That is in this very fabric of the land that we're in. And Bruno, looking again, drilling down on those histories in Brazil and in the Caribbean, and its connection to the continent of Africa, and how that finds its way here. So I guess then if a question comes out, that it would be, do you also see the connections between these layers?
I do. And that's why I said I pulled from a lot of what we've talked about, and your work, as well as Bruno's work, and what we've talked about on that side. Because I think that most people think it's simple, but it's not. There's like, what you do is complex, what Bruno does is complex, what I do is complex, and then Charmaine is a whole complexity of herself, and then you have to kind of put it all into a big melting pot And somewhere amongst all of that complexity is the story that we're trying to tell. And so I think that if any of us did anything different, the whole story wouldn't get told. Like if you didn't do what you did, there'd be a big gap in the story and it wouldn't make sense. If I just did my part and Bruno did his part and vice versa. If Bruno wasn't there, then how would we have gotten all of what you're talking about around the world where he's showing the way that our movements were? So they all kind of play off of each other. And like, I don't think people realize that as much education as our different research and stuff is giving people, we're also educating ourselves amongst each other too, right? And we've learned so much on this journey as well. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I'm one of the top 3 finalists for the Viola Desmond project. I wouldn't have tried for that project if I didn't have this project.
Oh, wow.
You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
I wouldn't have.
I think you're freezing.
I don't know if I would have had such a big project if this wasn't so, and not even just that I did this project, that it was such a positive experience, because that matters too. You know what I mean? Like I'm walking away with a very good feeling and a very good taste in my mouth. And I know for a fact that I think each of us will work on future projects with each other because we've created a separate bond. And I think that's what this really is all about, because we are 3 different people, 3 different backgrounds. And like these slaves coming in from all over, they made it because each of them teaching each other how to survive. And that's what this kind of was about. So thank you, Charmaine, just so you know.
Thank all of you. Can I just say that was going to be my last question to all of you, because I want everybody to understand, listen, how hard is it to be a virtual fellow? Like Sam Guan lives in Mi'kma'ki, but the other Bruno, Jason do not. And part of what I asked of them is please become a cohort virtually. And they did it. They really did. And you can tell by their respect and their embrace of each other that they truly are a cohort. But, you know, that took work on your part. So can you just end by telling, how did you do it? Because I think next year's cohort, if we have one, will also be virtual. So some tips, please. Was this like, you know, you guys on Zoom together, on Teams, on WhatsApp? Like, what did this look like for you guys to build this bond and to share this research?
Maybe I can just add a small thing.
I would say all of the above.
Okay, all of the above, yeah.
That's also connected to the previous question. Like I think a WhatsApp group is something important to discuss, let's say, formal scholarship and art, but also to know more about each other. Something that in person would happen more organically. You know, let's have coffee. Let's have a beer. Let's go to my place and we have wine and talk, you know?
Right.
But there are other ways that are not so efficient as the in person, but it's possible. And I think this cohort idea, this interaction between scholars and artists and curators in the Institute under you is really original and great for Canada, because the Institute is doing not just, let's say, formal scholarship, but also a work of memory based on the discussions on formal scholarship, you know? Right. So it's really artwork informed by scholarship, and scholarship also informed by artwork. So many questions and thoughts when we look at art, at what Jesus is doing, what someone is doing, you know? So this interaction between, let's say, in my case, history and memory, in the making of history and in the making of memory, is amazing. How it's being done in the Institute.
Can I just throw back for people here? People who remember the beginning of the show, The View, when Barbara Walters started it all, she used to start that show by saying, I had an idea for a show. And for me, it was, I had an idea for an institute, and you guys have made that a reality even virtually. And what I mean by that, exactly what Bruno said. I was thinking, what happens when the scholar working on New Brunswick slavery gets to sit and have lunch with the artist working on PI? What happens? What is that magic that if they were not in the same space or couldn't talk to each other, that type of richness of sharing? What about this archive? Have you seen this document? What about this painting? Have you thought about what you're doing in this new way? What about this question? You guys have pulled it off. You're extraordinary cohort. Let me just end by saying, first of all, I'm so fortunate to have been able to meet you all and to welcome you all. Completely fortunate. I'm so proud of all of you for the work that you're generating. It's tremendous. And I'm honored to know all of you. This has been wonderful. What a way to put us on the map. You wonderful people, you wonderful scholars, you wonderful artists, Sam Guan. Thank you all so much. And thank you for sharing with those who are here. And just so everybody knows, of course, we're recording. So many, many more people will be able to listen and learn from your brilliant work. Thank you for today, everybody. Thank you, audience, for tuning in. We really appreciate you being here and your support of the Institute. Please check out our web pages for more events to come and hopefully for future cohorts as brilliant as this one. I'm not sure, but future cohorts to come as well. So thank you all and have a wonderful day.